introduce you all tonight, and I'll now hand over to Monsignor Joe. Monsignor, welcome.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Vince. It's good to be here with you. This virtual pub gathering, of course, would have been nicer to have been together in a pub, but this is the environment that we're in at the moment, and we make the most of it. And I thank all those who coordinate the theology at the pub and reaching out to so many people, especially at this time in their homes. And we've all had to learn new tricks and to do new things. So this is it's an incredible way. It's a wonderful way, and I thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak to you about the Eastern Catholic Churches. I've been working, as Vince said, here in Melbourne as a priest since 1982. I was the first Eastern Rite Catholic priest ordained in Australia, not the first one in Australia, but the first one ordained in Australia back in 1982. And it's been an incredible journey trying for myself to learn about the Eastern Catholic Churches. Although I was born in Lebanon and we migrated, I was a young child, to Sydney. And we knew we were Catholic, and that was it. It was enough. We attended the local Catholic church where we lived in Thornlea. And as I grew up, I knew there was a difference between Maronite and, but we were just told that it was Catholic, and that's how we grew up. But when I was becoming a priest, I had to learn a lot more about what it meant to be a Maronite, and I grew in this awareness of other Eastern Rite Catholic churches, that we are part of the Catholic Church, but we're not necessarily Roman Catholic. And this was, as I said, it's quite an adventure, because it was a learning process for me, and then it became a way that I can help others understand, especially earlier on with Catholic education, with so many Eastern Rite Catholic kids in normal Roman Catholic schools here in Australia, in particular in Melbourne. And we were able to do a lot of work with the teachers. So over the years, I've been able to do a lot of these talks and speak about the rites of the Catholic Church, or we used to use the word rite, now that we use the word church, the rites of the Catholic Church, or the Eastern Catholic Churches. It says the same thing. Back in 1978, Pope Paul II, saint, who is a saint now, said the Church must learn to breathe again with its two lungs, its Eastern one and its Western one. And this became the focus of a lot of our work in Catholic, with the Catholic education program that we had in the 80s. Pope John Paul II said this in 1987, as he was commenting on studies on the Oriental churches, which is how they were referred to in Rome, the Oriental Congregation, which is now the Congregation for the Eastern Churches. And it sort of set in place a whole process of trying to understand the whole church, the universal church, that's what Catholic means, as Western and Eastern. And this is something, it's not new. It didn't just happen with migration, but this is from the beginning of the church, the outset of the church, apostolic times. And this is why this is the core understanding of what it means to be Catholic, to be the part of the universal church. So when in looking at these Eastern Catholic churches, or the rites of the Catholic Church, how we understand them is that a rite can be defined as a community of faith. So it's a community, it's not a group or a village or a town, it's a whole community having a separate tradition. So tradition in the church is very, very important, because it's the basis of the movement of a lot of the Christian movements within the church. And it's founded by an apostle. So I said it goes back to the apostolic times, which has converted and matured an entire people to the teachings of Jesus Christ. So the earliest of our understanding of the church movement after the Pentecost, and the disciples filled with the power of the Holy Spirit began to go out and to preach. And it's what we understand by Eastern rites, or the Eastern churches, or the churches around the world, the church around the world, is this apostolic movement of the apostles that has converted and matured an entire people, So it's a whole culture, really, or people, to the teachings of Jesus Christ. So it's as Christianity was preached and taught to people, as people were converted, and as they established these churches with their liturgies, their spirituality, and their theology. So each rite or each church encompasses a distinct theology, a very distinct spirituality, and also law. Within the church, there's canon law, there's Eastern Code and Western Code. And it's characterized by its own cultural and linguistic influences. At the same time, each Eastern Church enjoys autonomy and independence from its sister churches. So I'll just explain this a bit. So each of the rite has a very distinct theology and a spirituality. So a lot of that is from the very beginning of the church, the cultural groups, the linguistic group, the historic situation at the time, and how that developed. And we know that within the church, there is the code of canon law that governs the activities and the governance of the church and the properties. So within the church, there's what they call the universal law, applies to everybody. There's the particular law that applies to particular places. There's Eastern law and Western law. And the Eastern churches have what they call the codes of canons of the Eastern churches, which was again promulgated and renewed over the years. So each of the churches is characterized by its own cultural and linguistic influences. So the languages of the early churches were very important in the way that the prayer formats developed, the theology, the chanting, the music, the understanding of their relationship with God and how that developed, and it was expressed in the liturgy. So some of these languages are crucial to our understanding. So we've got Latin in the Roman Church, we've got Aramaic in the Antiochian Church, we've got the Coptic in the Alexandrian Church, and the Constantinople Church. We have the Greek linguistic influences, and the development of theology and understanding and prayer formats are very much linked to this cultural and linguistic influences. So each of the churches is also autonomous and independent from its sister churches. So here in Australia, myself, I'm a Maronite priest. I belong to the Maronite eparchy of Australia. I have a bishop who resides in Sydney, Bishop Antoine Charbel-Tarabay. In Melbourne, I'm a parish priest of the parish of Melbourne. So I am not under the jurisdiction of the Archbishop of Melbourne, but I'm under the authority and the jurisdiction of my bishop in Australia as an Eastern Rite parish that is present in the Archdiocese of Melbourne. So we are autonomous churches, and there's a number of Eastern Rite churches here in Victoria and in Australia, and we are independent and autonomous from the other churches that are present here. So this is the differences, but what unites us, all rites are united in the same profession of faith. So when we say the creed, we say the same creed. It's the creed that you would say at Mass, at every Catholic Mass. We profess the same creed, and we have the same celebration of the mysteries or the sacraments, the 7 sacraments. But where it differs is the reception of those sacraments or the mysteries. So I, as the Maronite priest, when I do a baptism of a child, I would do the baptism and confirmation at the same ceremony. And if you go to the Melkite Church, they would have the baptism, the confirmation, and the first Holy Communion of the child at the same ceremony. So we have this concept of the same 7 sacraments. There isn't an extra one or one less, but when the children receive these sacraments, it varies from rite to rite, especially the sacraments of initiation. The other sacraments of healing and commitment are very much the same. And the other thing that we have in common is what we call the hierarchical unity. So hierarchical unity means the Pope is the head of the church. And as the Pope is the head of the church, we have what we call a patriarch, who is the head of the Maronite church. And some of the other rites would have their patriarchs, who are the head of the churches. And the patriarchs would say they are in communion with the teaching of Rome. But when a patriarch is elected, it is the Pope who gives the authority or the approval. Or when a bishop is elected in any of the churches, it still goes back to Rome, and the Pope must approve. So it's that same hierarchical unity that exists within the church, the whole Catholic Church, with Pope Francis is the head of the church, and as it works then with all the churches and all the cardinals, the patriarchs, the bishops. Our patriarch is a cardinal, and so that they would have the same, sharing the same responsibilities as we all do in the sharing of the good news of Jesus Christ in the world. So when we look at the history, when we go back into history, we see that the rites or these churches evolved from several centers of Christianity, the earliest of the centers of Christianity, among them being Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome, and Jerusalem. So each of the Christian traditions that we have in the world today, one way or another, have developed from these centers of Christianity. These are the apostolic centers of Christianity: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome, and of course the church started in Jerusalem, and the apostles set out from Jerusalem to go out into the world and to share the good news. So our understanding of the church, Jesus is the foundation. It's the church of Jesus. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And Jesus commissioned the apostles, go out into the whole world. And the apostles, when they received the Holy Spirit on Pentecost Sunday, they were filled with power and understanding and strength and knowledge, and they went out and they began to preach. So we know that they set out from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the mother of the church because that's where the apostles set out from. But there was no great liturgy that developed in Jerusalem. There isn't an Eastern rite known as the Jerusalem rite. Of course, as you know, Jerusalem, the city was destroyed in the year 70. The disciples and the apostles, most of the apostles went out. Peter went to Antioch. They went into different places, then to Rome, and then they began to establish the churches in these different countries across the world. So the four main centers, as we have them, would be Rome, and which is the Roman Church, or the Latin Rite, as it is known traditionally. We have the church in Antioch, which was a great city at that time in Jerusalem, great city for trade and education, and it was a real hub of multicultural events and people who went there and were a part of this city called Antioch, which in those days was in Syria. And it was known that St. Peter went to Antioch. We know that the spoken language at the time in Antioch was Aramaic or Syriac, because the Syriac was the most commonly spoken language at the time. And this is the language that we believe that Jesus spoke, and this is the language that we have in our liturgy. This is the language that is a part of the Antiochian liturgy. And the other city is of great importance is Alexandria in Egypt, and where the Egyptian church developed, the Alexandrian Rite, the Coptic Rite, the Ethiopian Rite, and the fourth one is Constantinople, the city of Constantine, Istanbul. And this was where the great Byzantine liturgies developed. And this was very much very, very different to the Antiochian or to the Western liturgies, because of their concept of icon, because of the use of the understanding of Greek theology and philosophy and the ways that the liturgies developed over the years, there was a stark difference between the Eastern and the Western liturgies. So the churches, we know it as Eastern and Western. The Western Church is the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And this was the Latin Rite, because the language was Latin, and it became the language of the Western Church. And it was also the language that was used when they were speaking to any of the other churches. It would be conveyed to them in Latin. It was the church. So I'm going to ask if this can be put so that people can see some of these names. So Antioch was Aramaic, Alexandrian was Coptic, and Constantinople was Greek. So in the in the Antiochian church, the church that developed in Antioch, we know that St. Peter, when we read the Acts of the Apostles, he went into Antioch. He was Bishop of Antioch before he went to Rome. And they developed the liturgy there. And it's a basic concept of the development of the liturgy using the culture and the language at the time in Antioch. So from this Antiochian church developed a number of Eastern churches, So one we know is the Armenian Rite in Armenia. One we know is the Syrian Rite, because remember Antioch was in Syria, or from there developed what is known as the Malankar Rite in India. So they were very dynamic early church, very, very dynamic. We had the church, our Maronite church is there also. We see it there, the Maronite church. We had the Chaldean church and the Malabar church in India again. So we had two different groups in India, the Malankar and the Malabar. And so in here we know them as the Syro-Malabar Rite. So these churches evolved in these different countries. Armenia, of course, Syria, Maronite. I'll speak a little bit more about Maronite, how we evolved, but it started in Antioch. St. Maroon was in Syria, then it moved into Lebanon, and it became very predominantly a Lebanese church. But with the migration and the early persecution of Christians, the Christians fled into Cyprus, they fled into different parts of the Middle East. Chaldean Rite is the rite that developed in the land that is now Iraq, Iran, the land between the two rivers, the two mighty rivers. And then you had from there, they developed, they sent missionaries, and we had what was known as the Syro-Malabar Church. So that's one group, one family of churches united in the Aramaic language. The Antioch is very much influenced by this language, by saints like Saint Ephraim, the early church fathers, and the movements of this tradition. It was a very, very dynamic church established by Saint Peter in Antioch, and then they sent missionaries out into all these other areas of the world, of the then known world for them. So Alexandria, which is in Egypt, Alexandria was also a great center for education. The great library of Alexander the Great, the great center where people would go to be educated. And Alexandria developed what is known as the Alexandrian Church. And we know this today as the Coptic Church, developed into the Coptic Church, which is the Greek word for Egypt, Egyptos. And then the Ethiopian Church, the Ethiopian Rite, where they were able to adapt to particular Ethiopian concepts of art and the formats of the liturgy. This liturgy is very, very different, very distinct, as all of the liturgies are. So this is one family of the liturgies that is very, very austere. They don't go much for the great decorations. They're very prayerful, very spiritual. It was a great movement within the church. Then the other group, the fourth group, is the Constantinople group. And this is the Greek influence, as I mentioned earlier. It's the Byzantine Rite. And here, what we have in Melbourne, we have the the Melkite rite, we have the Ukrainian rite, we have the Russian rite, and there are many, many other rites and groups and churches that belong to this section known as the Byzantine liturgies. And so they're influenced very much by the Greek language and the iconostasis. If you haven't been to one of these Byzantine churches, I would very much encourage you to go and visit one when lockdown is over, of course. And they're very, very beautiful. And the theology of icon and the concepts, it's quite moving. It's very, very beautiful because it reflects a lot of their theology and their spirituality, the spirituality of the church and the way that it has evolved over the years. So these are some of the churches. There is a book that is called The Eastern Christian Churches. And it says it's a brief survey, but there's lots of detail in there. He gives, in part 4 of this section, the Catholic Eastern churches, and he says, churches with no counterpart, the Maronite Catholic Church and the Italo-Albanian Catholic Church. From the Assyrian Church of the East, there's 2 churches, the Chaldean Catholic Church and the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church. From the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Armenian Catholic Church, the Coptic Catholic Church, the Ethiopian Catholic Church, the Syrian Catholic Church, and the Syro-Malankara Catholic Church. From the Orthodox Church, this is the Byzantine rite that I mentioned, there is the Melkite Catholic Church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the Ruthenian Catholic Church, the Romanian Catholic Church, the Greek Catholic Church, the Byzantine Catholics in Yugoslavia, the Bulgarian Catholic Church, the Slovak Catholic Church, the Hungarian Catholic Church, and other Byzantine Catholic communities. So they're not necessarily a church. So these are the Catholic ones. But there's also, he's got 2 pages of Orthodox churches. So you've got the Armenian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church. We don't have an equivalent Maronite church. We've got the Chaldean Orthodox, the Assyrian Catholic Church, the Alexandrian Church. The Coptic Church is predominantly an Orthodox church, although we do have a Coptic Catholic Church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church of the Byzantine tradition, we all know, because here in Melbourne, we have a number of Greek Catholic churches. This is the tradition that they would belong to. And over the years, a group became Catholic, and they're known as the Melkites. We have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church, but some of the Ukrainians became Catholic and the Russians became Catholic. So there's an equivalent Orthodox to most of these churches that as we would have them there on the chart. So what does that mean for us? What are the differences in our practical life and the way that we live? So myself as a Maronite priest, I would have Mass in our Maronite church. We have a church now in Thornbury, and we have Mass centres in Bulleen, St. Clement's in Bulleen, St. Gerard's in Dandenong. We have a Mass centre in Greenvale where St. Shadbel's Monastery and Parish has been established. So we have services for our community, and we have Masses, and we have the baptisms, we have sacramental programs, we have everything that would be a part of every normal Catholic parish. So where the rites affect our lives, Maronites, I'll speak about Maronites, of course. Maronites are expected to be married in the Maronite church because canon law says if a couple are getting married, they must be married within their right. If one of the Eastern Code of Canon Law says that the Maronite must marry in his right. The Western Code of Canon Law says if a Maronite marries, a Maronite girl marries a Roman Catholic boy, Latin rite, they can choose which rite they can be married in. In the Eastern Code, they cannot choose. They must be married by their priest. who is Maronite, Melkite, or whatever rite they would belong to. The child to be baptized, according to canon law, Eastern Code of Canon Law, follows the rite of the father, unless the father's not a Catholic. They would follow the rite of the mother. So the pastoral directives would affect us on a daily level. So when we have First Holy Communion, for some of the children who receive like First Holy Communion at baptism, as the Byzantine groups do, then they've had their First Holy Communion at baptism. So you can't say they have to have their First Holy Communion when they're 8. They've already had their First Holy Communion, and they can receive communion anytime that they are at church with their parents. So it would then affect us in the way that we relate to other parishes, and the way that if a Maronite gentleman wanted to be married in the Roman Catholic Church, he needs permission from our Maronite bishop. He's not just marrying outside his parish, he's marrying outside his church. So the direction needs to come from the Maronite bishop who would guide him in this way. Now, the liturgies of each of the rites is very, very different. The way that I would celebrate liturgy in our Maronite church is very different to the way that you would celebrate liturgy, say, in the Roman Catholic Church, or the Latin Rite Church, or the Melkite Church, or the Chaldean Church. So each of the rites, these are what I was saying about the distinct theology, spirituality, and the way that they would celebrate liturgies, or would celebrate the sacrament of baptism, or would celebrate the crowning ceremony, which is the ceremony of marriage. So each of these has developed over hundreds of years of tradition and history, according to their history, according to the language, according to the culture, according to the spirituality of that rite. So we all have the same Eucharist. Of course, there's only one Jesus, and we would all have the concept of the preparation of the gifts. We prepare the gifts before the Mass. We would have the service of the Word, which is the first part of the liturgy, and then we would have the service of the Eucharist, the book of the anaphora. And we have a book of anaphoras, or your Western Eucharistic prayers. And we can choose any anaphora, and there's quite a number of anaphoras that we could use. And the structure of those liturgies would be different. Where we would have the sign of peace would be different. When we would have the prayers of the faithful would be different. Our prayers of consecration are always sung in Aramaic in our tradition. I'm talking about the Maronite tradition. So the sacrament of the marriage, the sacrament of crowning, is also very different. We have the crowns, as all the Eastern churches do, and we have a whole system of liturgical celebrations, feast days, fast days, days that are special in our tradition. As would each of these churches would have days that are special and particular to their tradition and to the way that they celebrate their liturgy and the way that they unite one another in prayer as members of as a community of faith. So we have in the liturgical calendar, we have a liturgical seasonal calendar. Our calendar begins in the first week in November, and we have the Sundays of the church. Then we have our season of announcement, 7 days before Christmas, 7 Sundays before Christmas. We have a whole way of, then we have the season of Epiphany, when Jesus was baptized. It's a very special time. We bless holy water and bless all our homes. And then we would have the Lent. We have Ash Monday. We don't have Ash Wednesday. We begin we have the Sunday of the entrance into Lent. And then we would have our Ash Monday. On the Monday, we would get the ashes. And then we would move into Lent. Our Easter is the same time as the normal Easter, but we're all normal in our own way. We have the same dates in the Antiochian tradition as the Roman Catholic tradition, as the Western Church. Now, some of the calendars are very different. So some would celebrate their Christmas or their Easters that have 14 days difference because they follow the old Julian calendar, not the Gregorian calendar. So you have to understand the way I'm speaking tonight is very general about each of the churches, but each of the churches has its own 2,000 years of history and tradition, and the way that the churches have evolved and the history of that particular church has evolved. So with our liturgical seasons, I will continue. We had Lent, then we have the season of the resurrection, then we have the season of Pentecost that we're in now until the 14th of September. And then we have the season of the Holy Cross. And from the Holy Cross, we begin again the liturgical calendar again on the first Sundays in November with our Sundays of the Church, and we begin our preparations for Christmas. So each of our traditions and our spirituality is very much influenced, as I mentioned, by early Syriac understanding. There is quite a number of books, and it's a really fascinating reading early Syriac theology by one of our priests in America, Sili Bajani. And there's lots of articles that you could read on all the Eastern churches. And I would really encourage people to develop an understanding and to attend church. It's like attending any Catholic church, but it's a different way of celebrating that liturgy. Now, I'll speak a little bit about our Maronite church. As I said, we are Antiochene, so we began in Antioch with the church, the liturgy that developed in Antioch with St. Peter and the early church, and Antioch was the most dynamic city. We are named Maronite after a saint, Saint Moron, who was born around about the year 350, and he died around about the year 410. And he united a lot of people in prayer and taught them about Jesus, baptized people. He sent missionaries, a missionary called Abraham into Lebanon. And he never went to Lebanon himself. He lived in the mountains not far from Antioch, in what is now today known as Syria. And he, when he died, formed the basis of this church, of a church. They became to be known as the followers of Moron, of Saint Moron. Then over the next couple of hundred years, there was the church history where there was the Council of Chalcedon, there was different heresies, there were controversies about the understanding of who Jesus was. This was post-Constantine, the peace of Constantine, when Constantine was baptized and the empire became Christian. Then around about the year 690, when we had the Islamic movement through Antioch along the coast, and a lot of Christians in Antioch and in Syria, they fled because of their particular belief in Jesus. So this is when we had our first patriarch, the head of the church, in 694, and he was appointed, and he led the people into the mountains of Lebanon. And this is why we're so closely associated with Lebanon and with the mountains in Lebanon as a people who are fleeing because of their faith and in a way to preserve their faith. And they lived in these mountains. And if you ever get a chance to go to Lebanon, whenever you think it's safe enough, I've been there many, many times as we have. And the place where I was born is on top of one of these valleys where there were, when you walk down, there are caves where people over the centuries have lived and lived to escape persecution. So once they went into the mountains, there was no contact until the Crusaders came into the Middle East. And they found all these Christian communities thriving in the mountains. And the Pope, of course, they had no idea that they were there. They were reunited with Rome. The Patriarch was given the pallium. He was accepted as one of the leaders of the Catholic Church. And they began this support that they could to the Lebanese people who were living in Lebanon. So over the years, there was a Maronite college established in Rome, and it's still there today. I've stayed there a number of times. And this was a means, the father of the Holy Father back in the 16th century, to create an education, an educated priesthood that would go back then and teach and educate these Maronite people. Now, the first migration began with after the Crusaders left the Middle East. And the first group of migration, of course, was to Cyprus, which is an island probably like as far away as Tasmania is from Melbourne. And we have a Cypriot community and have had a Cypriot community for almost 1,000 years. And a number of our parishioners here in Melbourne are Cypriots with Greek names and speak Greek, but they're Maronites are very proud of their Maronite tradition and their Maronite faith. And today we still have a Maronite bishop of Cyprus. So the migration then began as the Middle East became a bit of a place where there was lots of persecution and misunderstanding, people going there for safety, people leaving there because of safety. Migration began to South America, then it began to Australia, then to North America, and to New Zealand, to Canada. Of course, there was a lot in New Zealand before they even came to Australia. Wherever the Maronites went, they would establish a church. So in Australia, they established a church, first church in 1894 in Redfern, St. Maroons in Redfern, which is still our cathedral to this day. And over the years, since 1894, the patriarchs have sent a number of priests to serve the community. In Melbourne, we've had a parish here since 1955, and the parish was founded by Monsignor Paul El Khoury, who has since passed away. And I came in and worked with him as a young priest some 40 years ago. And we've continued his vision for this parish here in Melbourne. Over the years here in Melbourne, each of the Eastern Rites also have what we call religious orders. So we have, as you have Franciscans, Dominicans, the Franciscan nuns, Franciscan priests, we also have a number of religious orders. All the rites have religious orders. In Melbourne, we have the Antonine sisters, the nuns, who came in 1980 here to Australia. And we also have an order of Antonine monks who also work with us in the parish at the moment. In Sydney, there are different orders. There are the Holy Family Sisters are in Sydney, and there are the fathers of the St. Charbel order, the Lebanese Maronite order, and the Lebanese Missionary order, the Cramists. And there's another order called the Mariamists. So these orders are a part of each of the church, and the Eastern churches have religious orders in them. Because initially, the religious orders are the core of these groups. They provided the education, they provided the teaching, the learning, and the spirituality. One of the things I think it's also very important to note is that all the Eastern rites have married clergy. And this is something that, it's not new, because the church, the whole church had married clergy for the first 1,000 years or so. And the only ones who were not married would be the priests who belonged to the religious orders. So if you belonged to an order, you took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But then you had diocesan priests or priests who worked in parishes or in the villages or in the towns, and they would normally be married in Lebanon. This is the history of our Maronite church. When I first was looking into becoming a priest, one of the conditions in Australia back in the 70s when I was training was that I wouldn't be married. And then, but since then, we have a number of married priests in all the rites here in Melbourne. The Maronites, we have married priests in Sydney. We have the Melkite priests are married. The Ukrainian priests are married. So it's an option, but you have to be married before you are ordained a priest. This is the tradition of the early church again. So it would be a man in the village, somebody who wanted to be a priest. He must be married. He'd be married, and then he would be ordained a priest, and he'd be appointed to serve as a diocesan priest, working with his bishop in a particular town or village or whatever ministry that the bishop would appoint him to. So the married clergy issue has never been an issue in the Eastern churches. They've always maintained the right of a man to be married and to become a priest. And many now, as I said, many of our priests are married and have been married. So it's only in the Western Church that celibacy became you had to be celibate to be a priest in the Roman Church, in the Latin Church, and this was so after the first 1,000 years of history of the Church, from my understanding. So all these churches evolved and developed and re-evolved and developed depending on what was happening around. The Middle Eastern churches has very much been a church of very much persecuted, very oppressed, living under heavy restrictions under the Ottoman Empire, the Mamluk Empire, controlled by different countries. They were very, very restricted in what they could do. But over the years, they proved themselves to be very resilient and quite passionate about their faith, that they were able to survive these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of persecution and oppression, and be able to thrive with the first opportunity that came. And they have migrated to different countries in the world, as I mentioned earlier. And in Australia, we have established we have an aged care facility, we have a primary school and a secondary school here in Melbourne. We have a number of schools in Sydney. We have aged care facilities, childcare facilities. So we cater for the needs of our parish from a very young age right through until aged care. And we provide a number of services for our youth, our teens, the teenagers, the young married couples, family prayer groups. And we encourage an understanding of our Maronite tradition. So because of the language issues, our language, our liturgy, of course, in Lebanon, it's in Arabic, and there's some parts that would be said in Aramaic, like the prayers of consecration, or the prayers of incense, or the trisagion, which is a prayer we acknowledge God. Kadishat Aloho, Kadishat Hayelton, Kadishat Lomoyuto, Holy God, you are strong, you are holy, O God, you are strong, you are immortal. So we have these Eucharistic, traditional Aramaic prayers that are said in all our liturgies and would be said in the liturgies. But here in Australia, we're finding that because people like me, although I do speak Arabic, English is my language, and I would a lot of the younger people that would be a part of our parish may be able to speak a colloquial form of Arabic, or Lebanese, which is a colloquial form of the formal Arabic, but language is the language of the liturgy. So when people come to be married, they want it in English, or baptize their children, or the prayer groups or the youth group prayers and things like that. It's all done in English. We do have an Arabic only Mass on a Sunday, and that's at 8 o'clock in the morning. All our other services are either all English, or one of our main liturgies is a mixture of Arabic and English to cater for the young people, to cater for the linguistic differences. And we have a whole liturgy commission led by one of our priests in Sydney, Father Jeffrey Abdullah, who's a member of this international liturgical commission established by our patriarch. And this is to look at translating all our prayers, our services. They finished the masses. We have the whole cycle of masses now in Arabic and in English. The ceremonies, the sacramental ceremonies, the celebrations, baptisms, and the funeral service, the marriage service. These are all done. Our books are always in Arabic and in English, and we can go into either or at any one time. And this has been an incredible help. So we do use a PowerPoint service in our church where everything's in Arabic and in English. So if we say something in English, the people who read Arabic can follow. And if we say something in Arabic, the other half can follow. So the presence of the Eastern Catholic churches has been here in Australia. We've been in Australia as Lebanese. We've been in Australia, as I said, since the 1890s as a church. And some of the other churches haven't been here that long. The Chaldean Church, of course, what's happened in Iraq over the years, the Malabar Church and the Malankar. There's been an influx of Indian migration here into into Melbourne. The Coptic Church, the Egyptian community, is quite a sizable community here in Melbourne. The Melkite, the Ukrainian, and the Russian Rite. So of all those, I'll just let you know who has a bishop here in Melbourne, the Maronite, in Australia, sorry. The Maronite Church, we have our bishop in Sydney. The Chaldean Church have a bishop in Sydney as well. The Melkite Church have a bishop in Sydney, and the Ukrainian Church have a bishop here in Melbourne, in North Melbourne. All the other rites, where there is no resident bishop in Australia, they would be under the jurisdiction of the local bishop of Melbourne, the Archbishop of Melbourne, where there is no resident bishop in Australia. So this is a very really bird's eye view of the Eastern Catholic churches as they are present. As I said, each of them have a 2,000-year history, and each of them are very, very proud of their history. A lot of the times the history is entailed persecution and fleeing for their safety, for their faith, for their families, for their children. And this is a sign of this faith that we carry. And it's a sign, it's a wonderful sign of the Catholic Church, the universal church, where we can be one, united as one under our Holy Father, the Pope, and still be diverse and still be different and still be able to celebrate our tradition, our history, our liturgies, the way that we have learned from our forefathers and our ancestors over the years. And of course, the Roman Rite is the one that most people would be familiar with. And the Roman Rite is known as the Roman Catholic Church. And this is the predominant rite here in Australia, of course. It's very well established with the archbishops, the bishops, the parishes, the parish priests, the orders of priests and nuns here in Melbourne, in Australia. So each of the rites is established in the same way, but they would be a much, much smaller scale. And they'd be catering very much, I remember when I first started in Melbourne working with our parish, it was very much a very migrant community, because the 60s, and a lot of people came to Australia in the 60s, as did my family. But in the 70s and 80s, with a lot of time of establishment, a lot of the children were born, and English became the main language of expression and learning and understanding. And so we had to go into all of this English liturgies to cater for our particular youth and our particular families in our community. So it is it's a wonderful thing to understand that we are all united in faith. Jesus, of course, is the foundation of our church, and he, through the Holy Father, we are united as the Catholic Church, or the universal church. And we come from such a varied number of backgrounds. We have such an incredible history for each of the churches, and we have such an incredible understanding of art, icon, decorations, liturgical celebrations, liturgical music, the concepts of chant, the concepts of the evening prayer and morning prayer, and as they've evolved over hundreds and hundreds of years, so many different countries in so many different languages, and all to praise God and to follow the commandment of Jesus, go into the whole world, baptize and teach people to observe my commandments. So basically, this is what all I had to say. I'd really like it if anybody had any questions about any of these rites. As I said, some of you may have had experience with some of the rites, and some of you may not. But if you can look up online, you would be able to get any of the addresses of the churches, and everybody would be more than welcome to attend any of the local Eastern Rite churches and to experience their liturgies, their chanting, the incense, the celebration, and just be. I'm sure you'll all be captivated by the wealth of spirituality and theology and understanding and different ways of approaching the same great liturgical celebration of the Eucharist, and our understanding that has developed over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of our history. So I thank you very much. I hope that was that you found that something new in that and learned something new about our church. If you really want to look up some of the things, I recommend the Eastern. It's called the Eastern Christian Churches, because this book looks at Orthodox and Eastern Catholic rites. So the Orthodox churches, there are many of them in the history of the church. And initially, before the peace of before Constantine was baptized, there was the Christian church. Then you had the different heresies or schisms or people who wouldn't accept this particular teaching, the Council of Chalcedon, the Council of Nicaea. Some people accepted, some people didn't. They formed their own church. Some people think that they're the original church. We believe that we are the continuity of what was founded by Jesus on Peter, and this is how we understand our Catholic Church. So do we have any questions?
We do. I guess before we get to that though, thank you so much, Monsignor. That was a wonderful overview of the Eastern Catholic churches and traditions, and I guess a deep dive into history to really understand and appreciate how the church has grown organically since the very beginning. I know personally, as a Latin, but probably like many other Latins, have grown up and really only knew about the Roman Catholic Church because that's all we saw, that's all we were exposed to, and it wasn't until many years later I actually started to realise there was a lot more than just Rome in the Catholic Church. And I think it's a beautiful thing. There's so much that the East and the West can, especially in the East, that we can appreciate, so much beauty that the West is probably just not aware of.
Yeah.
And so I really thank you for that wonderful overview. I'll go now to some questions, and we have a few of them, and some of them are quite good. But I'll kick off with one, and this is about married priests in the Eastern churches, and sort of two parts to this. The first part, can married priests become bishops? And the second part is, does the ability of most of the Eastern Catholic churches to ordain married men, unlike the Latin Rite, still cause tension with the Latin Rite? As a member of the Latin Rite, it seems an internal inconsistency that is at times hard to reconcile with a church that prides itself on consistency.
Sure. So I'll answer the first one. The married priests do not become bishops. So traditionally in the Eastern churches, the bishops would come from the religious orders rather than diocesan priests. I'm talking about history here, historically. So the religious orders of monks and most of the bishops would have belonged to the religious orders. Although not every priest chose to be married. So there were still diocesan celibate priests even throughout the history. And but the married priest was not eligible to become bishop of a diocese. So that's historical, and the way also if a priest's wife died, he couldn't remarry another woman. He couldn't remarry because you cannot be, the tradition of the early church, this is how the thing has evolved, that you couldn't, you had to be married before you're ordained a priest. And if your wife should pass away, you couldn't remarry again after that. So that was the first question. I hope that answers that one. So the bishops usually came from religious orders. The second one, the decisions that were made to within the church, and I'm going back 1,000 years or so when these decisions were made. It's not something that's happened now. So all that happened was that the Eastern churches were able to maintain their traditions, and the Western church stopped that particular tradition of having married clergy. So that was just back then, and that's how it was. It just evolved over the next 1,000 years as celibate priests within the Roman Catholic Church. And the Eastern churches have always maintained married clergy. So it's not. I don't think it's never been a point of contention or a disagreement or whatever. It's just the traditions of the Eastern churches as I mentioned before, the tradition is very important of the distinct spirituality, cultural, and all these sort of things. Why the church made those choices, it really needed a historian and somebody with history to go back in and try and understand the depths of what was happening and why it happened at that time.
Yeah. And our next question concerns
what was happening and why it happened at that time.
Particular Eastern understanding of the role.
And our next question concerns the role of Pope. And is there a
Patriarchs.
particular
How do
Eastern
Eastern
understanding
Catholics
of the
understand
role
and make a
of the
case for
Pope, for
papal
example, first among
primacy
equals or
/availability?
among
Is the Roman
patriarchs?
Pontiff seen
And how
as
do
the final
Eastern
apostolic
Catholics
doctrine?
understand and make a
Yes,
case for
absolutely.
papal
As he is
primacy
throughout the
/availability?
church, we have the
Is the
same
Roman Pontiff
understanding, the
seen
same
as a
teaching,
final
the
arbiter
same
of doctrine?
understanding of seeing the Pope
Absolutely.
as the
As he
head
is
of the
throughout the
church,
church, we
and
have
he
the same
makes the
understanding,
final
the same
decisions. He's the
teaching,
one
the
who.
same,
And we have
understanding
when
of
our
seeing
bishops
Jesus the head
meet
of
when
the
they need
church,
to elect a
and he
bishop.
makes
The names
final
go to Rome, and
decisions.
the
He's the
Pope has
one
to
who,
approve.
we
It's
have
always the
our
final
bishops
call, and
meet when they
and
need to
the
elect a bishop,
teaching authority
names
of the
go to
Pope,
Rome
of
and the
course,
Pope
then
has
would
to
apply.
approve. It's always
Excuse
the
me, to
final
all.
call, and the teaching authority of the Pope, of course, then would apply excuse me, to all Catholics. So it's not just to the Western Church. As if he's speaking as Pope or he's teaching as the head of the church, then it's for the whole church. It's not just for some people or a few people. So there would be some things, if he addresses the Maronites, of course, he's addressing the Maronites. But if he's addressing the Melkites, he's addressing the Melkites. But if he's addressing the Catholic Church, it's we're all Catholic. We're all Catholic under the same, that's that hierarchical unity that we would understand, that the Pope has the supreme authority within the church, and the infallibility of the Holy Father to teach and to guide and to lead us. Yeah, so it's exactly the same for all churches. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. I've heard concern over there being a Latinization of the Eastern churches. What does this mean? And how do you answer the charge that Eastern Catholic rites are Latinized?
So I didn't get the last few words.
Oh, and how do you answer the charge that Eastern Catholic rites are Latinized?
Yeah. So what happened? Again, history, a little bit of history. We had the Reformation in Europe and a post-Reformation Europe, where a lot of churches were breaking away from the church, and we saw the Reformation with the development of Protestantism and different groups in the church. So the Pope sent missionaries into the East, the Middle East, and especially into Lebanon. This for us was known as the Latinization time, because they made people adopt Latin vestments, Latin liturgies. They introduced statues into our churches. They introduced a lot of things that were very Roman and not Eastern. And it became a norm within the church. So the church was, our church, I'm speaking about our church here, was Latinized. And post-Reformation, this is what happened till recently, till after Vatican II, the popes began to say, well, as we're renewing the liturgy and we're renewing all the traditions and we're looking at the whole church, it was an opportunity then for the Eastern churches to renew their liturgies. And so our vestments were restored. We were able to go back into get documents and look at our liturgies and take out what was seen as a Latinization part of our liturgies. In the Eastern rites, very rarely would you have statues in churches. This is what we call part of the Latinization influences, because the statues are very much a part of the Roman churches. They were part of Rome. When you go to Rome, you see the senators and the Romans and these statues all over Rome. It was a part of again, part of the history. The Eastern churches, especially like the Byzantine or all of us, basically, statues are not part of our churches. This is part of what we call the Latinization, or the Latin influence on the church, on the liturgy, on the decorations in the church, on statues, and so we've been able to restore over the last 40, 50 years our liturgies and our vestments, and been able to look at the canon law. We've been able to look at a lot of things. So it's probably we are probably at a good stage now where we're looking at all these original liturgies. We're celebrating the liturgies has been the history of our church, the history of our tradition, and all the other churches have done the same. So it's the Code of Canon Law, as I was saying, it's not just for the Maronites, it's for the Eastern churches. So it applies to everybody. So there was a time of post-Reformation Latinization, and you'd need, if you're interested in that, go back into the history of the 17th, 18th century, and we see a lot of influences there. A lot of the Jesuits in the Middle East are telling people that this is the way it has to be done. This is what the Holy Father wants. These are the vestments you got to wear. This is the liturgy that you have to say, because they really didn't understand the East as well as they would have understood European culture. And so that's why the college was set up in Rome. That's why they tried to bring in people to learn and to teach also in Rome, so they could learn a bit about the Eastern traditions and the Eastern languages and the Eastern concepts. So it did happen, and we think we're really have just gone over that over this last since Vatican II. It's been an incredible job at relooking at our history, our laws, our liturgy, our vestments, our decorations, our churches, and things like that. So yeah, it's a good question, but it has happened, and we've really come out the other side now, where we are looking at all our traditions. We have our traditions sort of basically restored to the original.
Yeah. Well, from canon law to canon of scripture, we have a question here. Do Eastern Catholics share the exact same canon of scripture as the Roman rites, or do they have additional books?
No, we have whatever again, this is part of the teaching authority of the church. Whatever the Pope teaches on that, and whatever is the Catholic Bible or the books that we would read in church, that'd be the same. We don't have anything extra that I'm aware of, or that we have. It's just we use the same readings, the same Bible, same texts that are told by our Pope, our Patriarch, our Bishop. It's all this one group working together. Yeah.
All right. The next one's a hypothetical.
I like hypotheticals.
If a bishop from a rite other than Latin, say Maronite, became elected as Pope, would that bishop then become a Latin prelate, since he would become Bishop of Rome, or become a Pope from that rite?
Well, there have been historically, there've been bishops from different rites in the early church. I'm not talking about the last, after a Renaissance and Reformation, the church became very, very staid in its procedures. But the early church, they speak about bishops who were from Syria and bishops who were of different traditions. But the Pope, as the head of the church, is not necessarily just, he's the Pope of Rome, but he would be a Pope of the church, not just so much, Rome's just the city. So he'd be the head of the church. So the Pope can celebrate liturgy in any of the rites if he should so choose. But the Pope is the head of as we have it, as we understand it, head of the Roman. He's the Patriarch of the West. We have the Patriarch of the East. So the Pope would be the head of the church. So he wouldn't necessarily turn into a Latin rite or a Maronite rite. It would be the position that he would hold as the head of the church, which is still Catholic, and which would have the same role and same authority, whether he's this one or that one.
Absolutely. And following on from that, it's another hypothetical, but if an Eastern was to become Pope, let's say Melkite, for instance, would that mean then the language of the church would alter from Latin to Greek?
No, of course not. The church, nothing would change really. Nothing would change. He'd be just the head of the church. We wouldn't have to change the language of the church. That I don't think they would have to anyway. That's very hypothetical. I don't think it's ever been a major point of discussion. But it would be that any like I said, our Patriarch is a cardinal, and as cardinal he has a vote, and any cardinal can become Pope. Anybody can become Pope. So it's not necessarily just a but it's very unlikely because it's of the nature of the position and the role as the head of the church. But any one of them can be appointed. It doesn't exclude him because he's Maronite or Melkite or Chaldean or Ukrainian or whatever. If he's a cardinal, then every cardinal then is in that same position there as the other cardinals. I don't think he'd have to change his language. I don't think they'd have to change the language of the church. He'd have to say the liturgy. If he's doing a mass in Rome, it'd be doing the Latin liturgy, and that would be how he would. That's how he would be seen. But again, that's hypothetical. God, they can do anything they want.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Next question here. Do you feel the process of ecumenism assists the Catholic Church in breathing with two lungs, and does it assist the Church in uniting both West and East?
I think ecumenism is wonderful, and within our community here, we have Lebanese Orthodox, and their church isn't far from ours. When we have a common Palm Sunday, we do our processions together. We come, the Orthodox and the Maronites, and we gather together and we do the procession. So we are united in culture and people and intermarriages and friends and whatever. So we've done that a number of times in our church in Thornbury. I think there's the Easterners tend to be more open to the Catholic, Orthodox, and other religions because of they live in proximity to a lot of these people, say in Lebanon or in Egypt or in Iraq, Iran. They would have had neighbours who were Orthodox, neighbours who were Catholic, neighbours who belonged to the Melkite rite, neighbours who belonged to this rite. So they would have been more familiar with all of these traditions. And there's very, very little antagonism between these the religions. So ecumenism it's a wonderful thing, and the rites I see in our churches, we have a couple of times in the year where we'd all get together. We have the Eastern rites. We say the night before the Assumption, we have hymns to Mary, and each of them would come in, and their choirs would sing a hymn in their own language or in their own traditions, and the variety and the diversity is just incredible. And it's all saying the same thing, but expressed in a different culture. So the early church had a way of adapting to the different cultures and languages, which I think we lost that along the way in history. And I think ecumenism and trying to get together is trying to go back to these original years of the establishment of the church, where everybody was equal. It was only Christian. There was all these people who were all the same. We all believed in the same Jesus, and we're working together as a community of faith. And it's important that we all see this as a process and as a way where we all need to be involved and all need to be open to the workings of the Spirit, and all need to be able to work together in the community. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing. As I mentioned earlier, within our community, we have a lot of our people who are now marrying. 2/3 of our young people marry non-Maronites and non-Christian and non-Lebanese, and we get all sorts of cultures. So we're opening up to a whole variety of people, and this is really exciting, and it's really, really wonderful. And a lot of them come into our liturgies and weddings and baptisms and funerals and things, and they're captivated by the liturgy, as we would be if we went to a Ukrainian liturgy or a Melkite liturgy. It's something that's really different, and it's very, very, very beautiful. It's an incredible way of uniting people of faith, communities of faith together.
Yeah, definitely. We might just stick on the theme of the Maronite Church with the next couple of questions.
Yes.
Firstly, you were talking earlier about how, I guess, when a lot of the Maronites left Lebanon and went to different countries, then there was a bit of I don't know if you call it like a disconnect with the formal form of Arabic. But I guess the question here is, was there a particular point when the Maronite Church started to say Mass in what would be the vernacular, or was it just a gradual progression, or is it quite different to our experience in the Roman Church, where there was a particular time in history where I guess the vernacular was formalized?
No. Well, I think it just depends when you have a priest who speaks that language. Here in Australia, that's how it was. There wasn't a time. Historically, our mass was in Aramaic. That's our liturgical language, and that was the language of history. Arabic is quite a recent language, really, since the rise of Islam, and Arabic became a major language. So, but as with people with migration, they adapted to, in South America, it became Spanish, and it wasn't like they weren't waiting for anything. It just went into Spanish because nobody could speak Arabic. In Cyprus, the liturgy was in Greek. In Australia, we had Arabic for the first number of years. I said I was the first ordained priest, and English is my language. So we straight away started doing liturgies in English, and baptisms and weddings, and it really made the difference for the young people, and it made our church very much a part of their lives. And it was a great means of reaching out to them and working with them and developing our youth groups and our Bible studies and prayer groups and things like that. We still have people who prefer things in Arabic, but it's not as bad. Or I say bad. So I remember when I started doing things in English, a lot of the older ones didn't like that very much. They wanted everything to stay in Arabic because it was a sense of security for them and they could understand it. But the young kids, as the young kids got more involved in the church and the community, and the parents were so happy to see their kids involved, their children involved in church and activities, and we had no problem evolving. So it was just more of a meeting the needs of our people rather than a time or that we were allowed to. Our patriarchs have always been very keen, very encouraging that we do meet the needs of the people, encourage us. Our bishops have always encouraged us to do masses in liturgies in English, and especially the weddings and the Eucharistic celebration, the Mass, and things like that. So it's been an incredible thing to see the young people more active and involved because they can understand what's happening, and we've had no restrictions on that whatsoever in the history of our church. Say here in Australia, in Sydney and wherever we are, we have English liturgies and weddings and baptisms and celebrations because that's the language of the core of our community now.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's quite wonderful that the Maronite Church in particular still has the Aramaic. So in an English Mass, would you still use Aramaic for the words of consecration?
Our words of consecration are always in Aramaic. That's what the Liturgy Commission the Patriarch has asked of us, and this is what we maintain. So whether it's French, Spanish, English, Arabic, whatever, the prayers of consecration are always in Aramaic. Yeah.
Awesome. Considering that's the language Jesus spoke, I think it's quite amazing.
Yeah. It's a great link. It's a great link with the history, with our faith, with Jesus, of course. Yeah.
Last two questions for tonight, Monsignor. Do Maronites in Australia have their own seminary, or are they integrated with the Roman Catholic seminaries?
When I started, I went to the seminary here at Clayton, Corpus Christi, Clayton, back in the late 70s. And since then, there have been a number of guys who've trained to be priests in Australia, and they've been at the local seminaries here in Australia, in Manly, in Sydney, in Strathfield, in Sydney, in Brisbane. So our bishop is very keen to establish a seminary, and he's been working on establishing an Eastern seminary in Redfern in Sydney. And this is but at the moment, the seminary, or till now, the seminaries have all gone to the local seminaries in the city where they lived, or basically in Sydney, and they trained there, and they're ordained by our Maronite bishop, according to the Maronite tradition.
Cool.
But we're looking into we've done a lot of work in establishing a seminary in Redfern. We're just waiting for seminarians. So it's So we've got one young man who's been ordained, who was supposed to be ordained on the 21st of August from Melbourne. He'll be ordained in Melbourne, of course, but he's in Sydney at the moment. Because of the lockdown, they couldn't come down with the bishops in Sydney. So whenever the borders are open and people can fly down, we'll have an ordination here in Melbourne, hopefully before Christmas. Yeah, we've had a number of priests who've trained in Sydney, and sometimes the bishops asked if they'd like to go to Lebanon to train, just to learn basic Arabic, to learn a bit of Arabic, to so they can communicate with a lot of the other members of the community. We still use both languages, but English is predominantly the main language. But it's important to know Arabic as well for those who are training.
Good, good. All right, our last question tonight's about devotions, and I guess there's some really popular devotions in the Western Church. The Rosary is probably the first thing that comes to mind, but are there any particular devotions in the Eastern churches that are quite popular that us Latins might not be aware of?
The Rosary is also a very incredible devotion in our tradition. This is one of the Latinization influences that came in from the West. So we have a lot of things like that, and the Stations of the Cross. These are all Western devotions, but we do have devotions to Mary. Mary is an integral part of our liturgies. We have devotions to different saints, ways of praying, fasting, days of fasting, times of fasting before Christmas, before Easter, before main feast days. The Stations of the Cross we have as a thing, but that again, that's a Western thing that came in through Latinization. So we do have a lot of devotions. We do have a lot of the Western ones that are still very much an integral part of what we do, and when we're the way we pray. A lot of people a rosary would be very familiar with the rosary and saying the rosary or having a rosary or wearing a rosary bead, and so it'd be very much the same. And the novenas and that they would have, that a lot of them, because they've been through Catholic education, been very much influenced by their local parish communities and groups right across Australia, they would have learned things and grown to love things, and this is how they share with one another and share with others. So whether it's the Latin rite or the Roman rite or other traditions and other rites where they mix with, but they do have a lot of devotions, and to me, it's as long as they're really praying and dedicating their life to God. If something means a lot more to them and they can use that, well, it's very, very important, and they can grow in holiness in that. But we do have lots of Eastern fasting prayers, devotions to the saints, and different celebrations that we would have that would be particular to our rite, as would be the same with any of the rites, to do with the history and the historical background that has evolved over such a long time and many years.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that concludes our questions for tonight, Monsignor. Thank you so much for joining us and for your time this evening. I really enjoyed your talk, and being able to talk about our Eastern brothers and sisters, I think it's fantastic. So thank you once again on behalf of Theology at the Pub, and to all the viewers out there, thanks for watching. Be sure to follow our Facebook and Instagram pages if you haven't already. We'll be posting content in the days and weeks to come, and also news about what our next talk and topic will be. So keep your eyes on our socials. But otherwise, that's it for tonight. So Monsignor Joe, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you. God bless.